Hi guys, my name is Sutapa and today we're starting a new chapter in history called Peasants, Zamindars and the State. तो ये हम आज एक नया chapter start करने वाले हैं and what this chapter is all about is the agrarian society and the Mughal Empire. तो बेसिकली हिस्ट्री के जिस फेज में हम हैं और जिस टाइम पे हम ये इस चैप्टर का जो बैकग्राउंड है जिस टाइम का हम पढ़ रहे हैं ये चैप्टर, it was set around 16th to 17th centuries. मतलब so that's how far back in history we're going to go. And this chapter is basically about the agrarian society in our country during the period of the Mughals, during the period in which the Mughals ruled our country, right? So we start with an introduction, or we start with what this basically is a background of the time, जिस time की हम बात कर रहे हैं उस time पे क्या क्या होता था, कैसे कैसे होता था, and then we start talking about the various the various components of what makes an agrarian society. We're going to talk about peasants, and we're going to talk about a lot of other agencies that were involved in the agrarian sector or in the entire agricultural sector, and we see how those agencies influenced each other, and we're just gonna discuss about the agrarian society as a whole during this period, during the period of the Mughals. So we start with an introduction. जिस टाइम की हम बात कर रहे हैं, at that point of time 85% of people lived in villages. तो हमारी कंट्री का जो पॉपुलेशन था उसमें से 85% लोग जो हैं वो villages में रहते हैं. And when we say that these people lived in villages, what we there's a implication that's hidden in the statement. What we're basically implying is that these people, these 85% of the population of our country were either directly or indirectly depended on agriculture for their source of life, source of living, right? So मतलब 85% लोग जो हैं हमारे देश के वो विलेजेस में रहते थे और वो डायरेक्टली या इनडायरेक्टली एग्रीकल्चर से इन्वॉल्व होते थे किसी ना किसी तरह से. बाय some means or the other, they were somehow always their job was related to the land. So, and the rest 15% that we had were the ones that lived in a slightly more developed areas, in areas that we cannot really call urban, or we cannot call those areas cities, but they were like towns that had come up because of all the trade practices that were going on during that period of time. This is like way back in history, and we didn't have industries or factories or any sort of modernization in the east at that point of time. So all we had in the name of urban areas was towns where trade was soaring, where trade was a very, very important commercial activity. But then those were like really few places, and very, very few people lived in those areas and participated in those economic activities. The majority chunk of the population lived entirely in rural areas. So that's where we are set up. That's the background of our discussion. So people mostly lived in villages and they were mostly involved with agriculture. Now, agricultural production was done by peasants and landed elites. So these are two different groups that we see in rural India, and these are different in every possible way, but there's one thing that's common in between them was the agrarian sector. So these were people who lived in rural areas. The rural areas constituted of peasants. तो peasants वो थे हमारे जो farming करते थे, जो so these were people who used to do the real work, and these were the majority of these people formed the majority of the agrarian population, but they were much poorer than the landed elites. So the landed elites were like the land owning classes, right? So these are like land owning classes. And when we say that they owned land, that makes them the richer sect of the population. They were the richer ones among the two of these, and that is what made them elites. So these people had land. Land is equivalent to wealth or money, and that is exactly what made these landed elites at the first place. So these were the richer population, and these were the poorer ones who were much larger in terms of their numbers, but they were much poorer than the landed elite. So these peasants, what they did, they mostly cultivated other people's lands, and they got some money for it, for cultivating other people's lands, and the money that they received was either in cash or in kind. So these people were either paid for their labor, or they were paid with money, or they were paid with a part of the produce that they had helped to cultivate. तो ये peasants जो है, ये दूसरे लोगों के farms को cultivate करते थे, ये दूसरे लोगों के खेतों में काम करते थे, और उनके बदले में उन्हें पे किया जाता था. उन्हें या तो पैसे दिए जाते थे, या जो भी वो कल्टिवेट कर रहे हैं उसका एक हिस्सा दे दिया जाता था. So that is how they were paid. They were paid either in cash or in kind. So these are the two groups of rural populations that we have. So peasants and landed elites were both involved in agricultural production. तो ये जो agricultural productivity है, जो भी चीजें cultivate होती हैं, जो भी हमारे पास produce है agricultural, so that was cultivated by both peasants, and there was a contribution of the landed elites in that. And the two of these were these two groups simultaneously claimed their rights to the produce. So the peasants thought that the produce should they should get the major proportion of the produce that they had cultivated, because they were the ones who had cultivated it. And the landed elites, they thought that they were the ones who should get the produce because it was their land. So the land was theirs and the labor was of the peasants. So these people contributed their labor. These were the ones that the land belonged to. So that made both of these groups. So that made both of these groups claim their rights to the produce. So they both these groups believe that the produce, or at least a major proportion of it, should belong to them. But then somehow in the end, it was always obviously the richer classes that benefited from this arrangement of agricultural production. But then that's not important. So these were the these were the division of the groups that we find in the rural or in the agrarian society. So now, because because they were linked via agricultural productivity, via agricultural production, or via agriculture at the first place. So these groups had relationships of cooperation, competition, and conflict. So these groups had a very dynamic relationship of there were a lot of things involved. There was cooperation because they were working with each other. Now the thing with the landowning classes was that they wouldn't spend their own time doing the entire cultivation process. They would hire other people to do it for them, because they had money and they didn't want to spend their days in the farm and do the work themselves. So they would often hire labor, the labor which belonged to the peasants, and so now they would require other people to cultivate their land for them. And also the peasants would require some sort of land that they can work on, because these people, these groups did not own land themselves. So these were not land owning classes, so they needed to depend on somebody else's land for doing the cultivation process. So there was also a relationship of cooperation between them, which made both of them dependent on each other. And also there was competition, because there was the produce at stake, who gets how much share of the produce. And both the classes, both these groups of people claimed their own rights to the produce, because one had put the labor and the other had provided the land. So and they are both, very, very important resources that go into the entire agricultural process. So there was like a relationship that was good and bad at the same time. So that was that was something that they couldn't do without, and that was something that they couldn't deal with also very in a very good way. So these are the two groups that we have in our rural society: the peasants and the landowning classes. And the relationships of cooperation, competition and conflict that we see between the peasantry and the landowning classes, this is what made up the rural society. So all this discussion just went into saying जो हमारे पास रूरल सोसाइटी था उस टाइम का, जहाँ पे मेजॉरिटी लोग रहते थे हमारे देश के, मतलब 85% ऑफ द पॉपुलेशन लिव्ड इन द रूरल सोसाइटी. और रूरल सोसाइटी was like so majority of our country was we basically were an agrarian country, we were a rural country. And so these were the relationships that we see in almost every rural society of our of our country. Wherever you see always there are these division of classes between the peasantry, or between the between people who didn't have much resources of their own, between people who didn't own much land. So all they had of their own was their labor, which they could put into farming, their agricultural skills and abilities. And there were these people, these landowning classes, these rich farmers who had acquired lots and lots of land over the years and over generations, and they have like they became really, really powerful, not just economically but also politically in some cases. So there was always this division of classes like in almost every rural society that we see. And this was the one of the defining characteristics of rural society in our country, rural society in India, at least in this period of time that we are talking about. So that was what our rural structure was. तो हमारा जो rural structure था, ये कुछ ऐसा था कि यहाँ पे हमें दो ग्रुप्स के बीच में एक डिवीजन दिखता है, जो कि जो resources उनको डिवाइड करती हैं, because one of them are rich and one of them are poor. So that's what divides them, right? So that's what rural society for us was. But then at the same time, in this rural society, there were outside agencies that somehow was able to influence this society, the relationships in the rural society. तो वो outside agencies basically क्या थे? When we say outside agency, what we mean is the state as in the the governing body, right? And at that point of time, when we had the Mughals ruling us, the state was a Mughal state. They had their own form of governance, and it wasn't much like the form of governance that we have today, but even then it was some sort of governance, right? So now in almost every country of the world, what we have as a form of governance is democracy. Back then it wasn't democracy, it was like an emperor ruling over a large chunk of land that he had acquired, battled for, and there wasn't much accountability in it, but it was still governance, right? So the Mughal state, when we say Mughal state, what we mean is the king and his and the various men that are working for him, for just the king. These people now had their influence in the agricultural sector, in the agrarian society, right? So how these these agencies, or how the men who were under the emperor, how these people had come to influence the agrarian society, is what we see next. So people from the Mughal state, जो एम्परर के लोग थे, जो एम्परर के भेजे हुए लोग थे, जो इस पूरे रूरल सोसाइटी में इंटरफेयर करते थे, उनका एग्जैक्टली काम क्या था? सो दीज पीपल वर supposed to be revenue assessors, collectors and record keepers. So these were men doing the official task of collecting revenues and keeping an assessment of it and then keeping a record of it. So this is what these people were supposed to do. They were supposed to because agriculture was something that the state derived a huge proportion of their taxes from. Like हमने बहुत मूवीज में भी ये देखा होगा कि गांव में आके लोगों से पैसे मांगे जाते थे in the form of taxes. So what this means is the state derived large sum of taxes from agriculture. So because these people had their lands and because these people were able to cultivate, so the state or the the king at that point of time would take huge sums of money collectively from these people in the form of taxes. It would take it from people individually, but this was one way of accruing revenue out of the people by the king. So agriculture is something that they could levy a tax upon, and this tax helped to increase the revenue that was collected by the emperor for various purposes. So that's what. So there were these outside agencies that had come from the state, that had come from our Mughal state, and so these people were, these people had the function of collecting revenue from people of the agrarian society, of keeping records of all these collections, of all these transactions. So that is what these people were supposed to do. Now, the reason why they would do this is because they wanted to ensure cultivation and they wanted to receive taxes. So why they wanted to ensure cultivation is because cultivation leads to these people giving taxes to the state, and their prime objective was to accrue taxes out of these people. तो ये इन लोगों का काम बस ये दोनों था. They would ensure cultivation. वो चाहते थे कि लोग फार्मिंग जो है वो करते रहें, कल्टिवेशन करते रहे, ताकि वो लोगों से पैसे ले सके, क्योंकि no cultivation done by someone means they cannot have a reason to tax them. So that because the tax was levied on the the agricultural activity as a whole. So they wanted to ensure cultivation so that they could derive money for it, and they wanted to keep on receiving their taxes regularly. So so for these two reasons, these let's just call them these Mughal agencies, these outside agencies would want to control agrarian society. So these are the reasons why they sought to control agrarian society, because they wanted to regulate how much cultivation was happening and how much, because the more cultivation takes place, the more taxes that they can accrue. So in a way, these people, these men of the state, these people would want to promote cultivation in the rural areas so that they can draw more and more taxes out of it. So that is why they would want to control agrarian society, and that's exactly what they attempted to do, because they wanted to ensure cultivation and they wanted to receive taxes. And because agriculture was so now at this point of time that we're talking about, agriculture was not just done for sustenance. तो पहले ये होता था कि लोग एग्रीकल्चर करते थे, मतलब एक जगह पे मैक्सिमम लोग, बिकॉज previously we weren't living in a modernized world. We didn't like much understand the concept of factories and division of labor and specialization. ये सब चीजें जिनके बारे में हम आज बात करते हैं, ये सब चीजें एग्जिस्ट नहीं करती थी. पहले हमारे पास क्या था? We had land, we had huge acres of land, and with civilization, we've learned about various ways that we can use that land. But previously what we used to do was, we used to hunt and we used to gather, and we understood the concept of agriculture, right? So we used to cultivate our lands, and we used to we used to consume our own cultivated produce. The cultivation that we used to do was hardly ever meant for such mass sale of the produce, but it was supposed to be for sustenance. So previously agriculture was meant for sustenance, but then over time it became more and more commercial. So during this period of time, we see that agriculture was becoming more commercial in nature, and there was a surplus in the agricultural produce that was meant for the sole purpose of being sold in the market. So here we see agriculture being a commercial activity. It wasn't just a sustenance. It wasn't the form of sustenance. It became more and more a commercial activity with a larger sector, a larger part of the produce being meant for sale in the market. And so with this commercialization of agriculture, with this with the change in the nature of agriculture being more commercial, what we see is, we see a lot of trade happening. So trade, money and markets now entered villages. So ये जो villages हैं, जो so these are not something that that had a lot of commercial activities going on. These were just these were just expanses of land that were meant for cultivation, right? So that was what our rural India was all about. So now these, with the commercialization of this agriculture, now what happened in these villages was, it started seeing a lot of activities, a lot of commercial activities. So now there was more trade in these villages. So now these villages experienced more more trade, more commercial activities. Money started flowing in, and markets started being set up in the villages itself. So now there was like less dependency on the more commercial areas, which we call towns, and now these villages started seeing a lot of economic activities. So what happened was, because of this increase in commercial activities in the villages itself, now these villages started getting linked with towns, because towns are exactly the places where commercial activities and where trade takes place. So now with these things happening in the villages, these villages also started getting linked with towns. And in fact, this is exactly the process of how a village or a rural area becomes more and more modernized or more and more urbanized over time, and it grows into a urban area, it grows into an urban settlement. So this is how the process happens. It starts with a so now these places, these were just meant for, these were just filled with people who were trying to cultivate certain crops and fill their bellies with it and sell some of it in the market so that they can earn some money. But then as this process continued, money started pouring into these villages, and now this sudden commercial activities that we see in the villages. So now these commercial activities help these villages get linked with towns. It sort of increased connectivity with other areas because of all these commercial practices. So that is how we start our chapter. That is how we start talking about agrarian society and this Mughal emperor, and how these were connected with each other. So so the first topic that we look at in this chapter is peasants and agricultural production. तो peasantry जो थी, गांव में जो peasantry exist करती थी, ये हमारे लिए बहुत important है. We look at the peasants in much detail. We see a lot of things about the peasants, but it's important for us that we analyze about how agricultural production or agriculture as a whole was very closely linked with these peasant group of people. It wasn't, the landowning classes, even though they were, much richer and much more powerful. Their classes was much more powerful, but then these people were a minority and they didn't have much to do with agriculture in the first place. It was the peasants who did most of the agricultural activities. So we talk about how the agricultural sector was very, very closely associated with the peasant group of people. So the first thing that we see are villages. So villages form the basic unit of agricultural society. Now these villages, so agricultural society is, or the agrarian society is what we're concerned with. तो इसमें rural areas जो हैं, जो villages जो हैं, ये हमारे लिए बहुत मायने रखती है. But then these are not the only things that come under agrarian society or agricultural society. What we're going to see later is that along with villages, we're also going to have to look at non-cultivable areas. These also come under the entire set of agrarian societies that we talk about, and we also see that forests are also a very important part, because these existed in very vast expanses. We had large expanses of forest which fall under the agricultural society. So we first talk about villages. So villages are like the most basic unit of agricultural society, and these villages were mostly inhabited by peasants. So these peasants were the ones who managed the tilling of the soil, sowing of the seeds and harvesting the crop. तो जो काम होता था, जो भी प्रोडक्शन को लेके जो भी काम होता था, वो मोस्टली ये पेजेंट्स करते थे. दैट इज व्हाई दे आर सो इम्पोर्टेंट, बिकॉज दीज land owning classes, they didn't do much of the work anyway. So, and they weren't even related in the entire agricultural process. It was the peasants who did the work. So these people did all these things, and also the peasants were the ones who contributed their labor to production of agro-based goods. So when we say production of agro-based goods like sugar, oil, etc., so at that point of time, whatever, so other than directly cultivating, whatever, indirect ways you have to being associated with agriculture. Now these peasants were the ones that were included in it. So when we talk about being either directly or indirectly depending on agriculture, तो direct dependency में भी ये peasants थे, जो जमीन को टिल करने का काम होता है, जो बीज बोने का काम होता है, जो क्रॉप्स को इवन हार्वेस्ट करने का काम होता है, ये सब ये peasants करते थे. और जो the indirect way in which you are associated with agriculture, that work was also done by the peasants. So these were the ones who actually did the work. The only thing that the landowning classes did was to accrue money out of their land, because these were the people who owned the land on which these practices were going on, and the land was essentially belonged to these people, to the landowning classes. So they derived their rent from the land. If other people wanted to work on their land, they just made them work, and they just they just took money for providing their land for this agricultural purpose. So these people, these peasants, these were also the ones that contributed their labor to the production of agro-based goods. So these people also, like, they were the ones who were doing the direct agricultural jobs. These were also the ones who were involved in the not so direct agricultural activities. And like stuff like sugar, oil, इनकी जो processing है, ये goods जो produce होती हैं, इनमें जो भी छोटा मोटा skilled labor चाहिए होता है, these also came from the peasantry itself. So these were like the primary organs of the entire agrarian society. Also, besides the village, besides the most basic unit of agrarian society that we have, besides that we also have certain non-cultivable areas. अब non-cultivable areas क्या है? So हमारे पास जो land है, so that is like our most important resource. Now land we can divide land into, when we're talking about agriculture, we can divide land into two parts. One of them is the cultivable area, जहाँ पे हम cultivation practice करते हैं. What decides the cultivability of an area is the fertility of the soil that is present in that land. So there's the cultivable area, the one that we can use for cultivation, and then there is the non-cultivable area, which we can use it for a variety of other purposes, but we can't use it for cultivation. So from agricultural perspective, that land is not very useful for us. So however, we can do other things with that land. We can build houses on it, we can build factories on it, we can do a lot of things with it, but then from the agricultural perspective, that land is not very important for us. So there was non-cultivable areas like dry land or hilly regions. So hilly areas में हमें ये पता है कि it's a very uneven topography, तो हम उस पे agriculture नहीं कर सकते. Cultivation is something that we require the plains for. Even though there are exceptions, there are large scale cultivations on the slopes of mountains, but then you can only grow particular crops which are suited to that sort of climate and that particular soil which you can grow there. You can't always grow all these food grains and all these things on hilly regions. Also dry land is something that there's no moisture, and moisture is something that you require very much for cultivation. So the soil in this kind of land is not something that is viable for agriculture. So these also form parts of the agrarian society, agricultural society में हमारे पास non-cultivable lands भी आते हैं, जो agriculturally it is more like a liability than an asset. And then we had forests. Now forests are, the reason why forests are a part of the agrarian society is because they made up substantial proportion of territory. So forests back then, at that point of time, forests used to be a big deal because there were huge there were vast expanses of forests, and forests were also places where people lived in, and the kind of trees that you had in the forest, you can derive a lot of raw materials from those trees. You could derive timber. One of the more important extractions that you can make from forests is timber. You can derive fruits and vegetables that grow on those trees. You can also derive a lot of herbs which have medicinal properties. So you can derive a lot of important things from the forest, a lot of things which are important not just for sustenance but also for commercial purposes, because these are things which you can sell in the market. So forests were also that is why we include forests as part of the agricultural society that we talk about. The agricultural society, of which the first and most basic unit is the village, which was inhabited by peasants, and peasants form the backbone of the entire agrarian society. So we have villages, then we have non-cultivable areas like these regions which are which are not something we can use for production purposes, and then or agricultural purposes, and then we have forests that that does a lot of things for us, but then these forests took up too much space than you can ignore, right? So these were like huge stretches of land where people also lived and where people drew their a lot of their subsistence needs from forests. So these are all the various these are the various components of the agricultural society. So we look at the peasantry in detail later on, but these are just the introductory points for what we're going to study later on in this chapter.